There is a long-standing myth that pop music and jazz exist on opposite sides of a glass wall. On one side, you have the reliable, functional three-chord sequence of a radio hit. On the other, the dense, unpredictable harmonic language of a jazz standard. Songwriters often feel trapped by this divide. They assume they have to choose between writing accessible songs that rely on basic primary emotions or creating sophisticated pieces that ultimately alienate their listeners. However, the divide between these genres acts as a doorway rather than a barrier. Sophisticated pop songwriting relies on borrowing the furniture of jazz to decorate a standard pop room. Closing this sophistication gap transforms a predictable progression into an emotionally complex arrangement without losing the mainstream listener. The process begins with chord extensions. Most pop songs are built on simple triads, three-note stacks of a root, a third, and a fifth. Think of the triad as a sturdy, structural primary color, like bright red. This keyboard shows how jazz expands that foundation by living in a world of 4 or 5 notes. You can stack a major 7th or a 9th on top of the tonic chord, the starting home chord of your key. These extensions are simply notes found 7 or 9 steps above that root note. When you do this, the function of the chord remains completely stable. The listener still hears the familiar home key they expect, but the texture becomes highly nuanced. It is like taking that primary red and mixing in a bit of white or blue to get a specific shade of crimson. The foundation is the same, but the emotional frequency feels significantly more expansive and nostalgic. Modal interchange involves borrowing a chord from a different scale, specifically the parallel minor. This means if your song is in C major, you momentarily borrow chords from the C minor scale. If you are in C major, your 4 chord is F major. It sounds bright and secure, but if you swap that out and borrow the F minor chord from the key of C minor, you create a sudden sense of yearning. This specific trick of introducing a sweet sadness shaped some of the most enduring hits of the 1960s, heavily utilized by bands like the Beatles to add unexpected depth to catchy melodies. Over the decades, that exact same harmonic substitution evolved to become the backbone of modern alternative and art rock anthems, notably by groups like Radiohead. The technique works because the vocal melody stays safely anchored within the original key. The listener follows the singer, while the harmony underneath shifts the emotional light. In standard pop songwriting, every chord usually belongs strictly to the safe, expected home key. Jazz composers, however, prefer to create many destinations rather than moving directly from one point to the next. A standard V to I cadence brings a musical phrase to a conclusion. Preceding a target chord with a secondary dominant creates a temporary pointing chord from outside the key. This creates a brief moment of tension that resolves quickly, making the arrival incredibly satisfying. Secondary dominants act as small scenic detours on a straight road. Your final destination remains the exact same, but the journey to get there feels vastly more intentional. At this point, you might look at your newly built progression and wonder why stacking these complex harmonies doesn't immediately alienate a mainstream pop audience. Rhythm functions as the final bridge between these worlds. When jazz harmony alienates mainstream listeners, the culprit is usually a beat that feels too swung or heavily syncopated, shifting emphasis to the offbeats and breaking the pop contract. Masters of the jazz pop genre, such as Steely Dan, resolve this by anchoring complex chords to a relentlessly simple, steady pop beat. Songwriters like Alicia Keys prove that a strong backbeat and a catchy melody act as a psychological safety net. That rhythmic stability grants the writer permission to take extreme harmonic risks. As long as the rhythm remains deeply rooted in the pop camp, the human ear is remarkably forgiving. An audience will bob their heads to a dense, dissonant dominant 13-flat 9 chord without ever realizing they are digesting advanced music theory. Incorporating jazz harmony into a pop framework serves the music rather than acting as a simple display of academic knowledge. These harmonic tools exist solely to expand the shared emotional vocabulary between you and your listener. Mastering this balance allows you to live fully in that sophisticated middle ground, proving that music can be deeply complex and universally accessible at the exact same time. This was brought to you by Notes and Silences. Thank you for listening.